Reformation on the rest of Europe. Okay, there are three areas that we're going to talk about when we look at the effects of the Reformation. The first area we're going to talk about is Germany. Okay, and when I talk about Germany, I'm basically meaning Central Europe, the area pretty much just straight up north of Italy. So find that on a map, and the area is also known as the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, and it's marked by religious wars. So I want you to write that down in your notes: religious wars. Okay, well, initially, after Luther's break, there was a lot of fighting. Well, one of the first things that was signed shortly after Luther's break of the church, relatively shortly, was something called the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 basically said that every prince in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany can choose what faith his people are. So they can either be Protestants, that means non-Catholic, or Lutherans basically, or they can be Catholic. But your prince chooses. And so that was the compromise. Well, the family that ruled the Holy Roman Empire was a group called the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were actually Catholics themselves. And so the land that they controlled, they didn't want to be Protestant. And in fact, they were led by a guy named Charles V. And Charles V is a really fascinating guy. He was part of the world called Flanders, which is in the Netherlands. And Charles V at one point actually directly owned and controlled more land in the world than anybody ever has, personally. Okay? And here's why. He not only controlled most of what we'll call today Germany and Netherlands and Switzerland and Austria, but he also controlled Spain, which meant that when Spain expanded into the New World, he controlled those colonies. And so South America, he controlled all of that. And so he said, no, we're going to take Catholicism and we're going to spread it around and we're going to be Catholics. Well, the rule of the Habsburgs eventually wound its way into what's called the 30 Years' War, which was yet another outbreak of fighting based around religion amongst these two groups against the Protestants and the Catholics. And it turned very violent. Germany was completely destroyed. Any ounce of unification that Germany had, which remember we said that Europe prior to the Renaissance was governed by little small states, not big countries, not big nations. Well, the Holy Roman Empire was just a collection of little countries that sort of got together and say, hey, we'll help each other out. It's basically what it was. Well, that Holy Roman Empire really disintegrated with the 30 Years' War because there was so much infighting. Okay, so the main thing I want you to get out of Germany is that there were many religious wars. The Peace of Augsburg initially ended the wars in 1555. The Habsburgs reinstituted and said, no, we want our possessions to be Catholic. And then the 30 Years' War reignited those things and finally ended in 1648 to the total destruction of Germany itself. Okay, in England, there was also religious conflict, but in a little different manner and not as violent. As we know, we've talked about Henry VIII. So Henry VIII comes out and he creates the Church of England. Well, that's all well and good, and his children really play out the conflict. His son, Edward VI, was sickly and didn't live very long. Okay, and so he kept the Protestant church under that his father created, but he didn't live long enough to make it really effective. Coming into play next was his daughter, his first daughter, Bloody Mary is what we're calling Mary the First. Mary the First was a Catholic and a devout Catholic. She said, no, 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 no. You guys are all going to be Catholic, okay? And so we're going to go back to Catholicism. And they even had this little thing worked out with Spain where the Spanish were going to try to come help her and take care of her. Well, Mary was basically overthrown and lost her throne to Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I ends up becoming the most powerful and influential, one of the most influential rulers in English history. And like I said today in class, or yesterday in class, she is the reason that we speak English and not Spanish. Okay? Her rule leads to that. So you need to know, I want you to highlight, underline, big letters. Elizabeth I makes sure that Protestantism remained in England. And the reason for that is it gave her more power and autonomy. Now, the version of Protestantism that really took root in England was obviously Anglican, but it also had a strain of and a thread coming from John Calvin, which was that Protestant work ethic. And so what happened in England is they really began to work hard, and the country allowed merchant wealth to grow. And so capitalism, or the idea that it's okay to make money and to gain capital, that's what capital means, is wealth and money, really began to take off. And so capitalism really takes root in England, and they help spread that idea to the Americans when they eventually come here. We'll get more into that later. But capitalism begins to grow and take solid root in England. Well, the last major country we're going to talk about is France. So what happens in France is also, again, religious conflict. The main thing you need to understand about this is that there was one particular group that was really heavily persecuted. Okay, the government of France is Catholic. Not always has been, but historically they are a Catholic nation. And so officially, the king had to be Catholic. And so the group that caught the most flack and their most dominant or largest Protestant group were a group called the Huguenots. The Huguenots were the French followers of John Calvin. Write that down, you need to know that. The Huguenots were the French followers of John Calvin. So they were the hardworking group, believed in predestination, believed that the Bible was your source, believed that faith is what got you there, and that you were predestined to go to heaven or not in your life would show that. Well, the Huguenots were persecuted pretty heavily, but the Huguenots had a friend in a guy named Henry of Navarre, okay, or Henry, who would become Henry IV. And so Henry of Navarre was a Huguenot. Well, some people died, you don't need to know who, but Henry was asked to become king of France. He said, and they told him, look, if you're going to become king of France, you have to become a Catholic. And he said, so you're telling me that if I become king of France, I just have to become Catholic, and that's all I have to do. So he said, sure, let's do it. And he issued what's called the Edict of Nantes. And under the Edict of Nantes, Henry said, we're going to stop religious persecution of the Huguenots. They don't, in order to be in France, to be a French citizen, you do not have to be a Catholic, which is what the rule was before. He said, no, we're going to have some religious tolerance. We're going to allow other Protestant faiths to exist. And so we're going to stop persecuting the Protestants and the Huguenots. And Henry IV did that with the Edict of Nantes because he used to be a Huguenot and he converted to Catholicism. Well, several years later, there was a ruler, there were some younger kings, okay? Louis XIII came to power. He was Henry IV's son or grandson, I don't recall. And he was too young to rule. And so this guy that came into power was a guy named Cardinal Richelieu. If you've ever seen any of the Three Musketeers movies, this is the bad guy in the Three Musketeers movies. Well, Cardinal Richelieu became the lead advisor for this king before he was old enough to govern himself. And Cardinal Richelieu was obviously a cardinal. He was Catholic. And so you would think that he would support the Catholic Church no matter what. Well, that simply wasn't the case. What Cardinal Richelieu did was Cardinal Richelieu took the 30 Years' War and said, you know what, if the Habsburgs, who are Catholic, lose power, that means France is going to gain power and influence. So I'm going to take the 30 Years' War and turn it from a religious conflict and turn it into a political conflict, because even though I'm Catholic, this guy is Catholic, I'm going to support the Protestants in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire in attacking the Catholic Habsburgs. And so Richelieu really changes things and turns things around and turns the 30 Years' War into a religious conflict into a political conflict. And that's part of what makes the 30 Years' War destroy Germany, is because you've got all these other countries basically fighting in Germany. France is fighting in Germany and supporting the Protestants in Germany against the Catholics, who have obviously the support of the Pope. And so that destroys Germany. But Richelieu is really important because he helps kind of further the 30 Years' War and turn it into that political conflict, even though, and support Protestants, even though that he is Catholic. All right, so what are some of the long-term effects? Those are the immediate historical effects that, span the 100 years time period or so, the 1500s, 1600s. But let's talk about some of the long-term effects of the Protestant Reformation. For one, step one is the growth of secularism. Again, secular means not of the church. Ism is idea. Growth of secularism, belief in worldly things. That's number one. People were no longer focused entirely on what the church wanted you to do, and so you were not just allowed, but kind of encouraged to do things as an individual. Step number two was the growth of individualism and the value of the human individual, and no longer to focus on a community. Okay, so your desire to gain wealth, your desire to do great things, grew dramatically during this time. Religious tolerance, obviously, it had to grow, even though there were many wars that were fought and still are over religion. It was the beginnings of a more accepting society and acknowledgement that there's more than one way to honor God and to worship religion. Now, we're still really only talking about Christians in Europe. Jews were not tolerated, okay? The Muslims, or Moors as they were called in Spain, were not tolerated. But it is the beginnings of religious tolerance and different religious ideals. And that's a slow change, but it eventually takes place. And lastly but not leastly is certainly the growth of education. Education grows because almost all of them believe that you got to read the Bible in order to understand what's going on, in order to be a good Christian. And so that led to the growth of education. The Jesuits started schools, spread schools, okay? And so they spread education themselves. But the idea that people had to be able to read in order to get to heaven, in order to understand the Bible and get to heaven, really played a significant part in growing education and people's desire to be educated and to become literate. All right? If you guys have any questions, send me an email and I'll be happy to answer them. But first, we've got a little quick quiz with the questions. So let's take a look. Question number 7 on your bubble sheet. So take out your bubble sheet. Who called the Council of Trent? Is it A, Paul III, B, John II, C, Peter I, or Mark? Question number 8. Who was the major Catholic reformer? Was it Loyola, James II, Henry VIII, or Elizabeth I? Number 9. Who solidified England as a Protestant nation? Elizabeth I, Bloody Mary, Charles V, or Edward VI? That's who solidified England as a Protestant nation. A, Elizabeth, B, Mary, C, Charles V, or D, Edward. Number 10. Where was the Reformation the most violent? Was it Italy, Germany, France, or Britain? A, Italy, B, Germany, C, France, or D, Britain. Number 11. What did the Edict of Nantes do? 1. Or A, freed the Jews. B, made only Catholicism legal in France. C, granted tolerance to the Huguenots in France. Or D, executed the Pope. What did the Edict of Nantes do? A, freed the Jews. B, made only Catholicism legal in France. C, granted tolerance to the Huguenots in France. Or D, executed the Pope. And lastly but not leastly is 12. Who turned the 30 Years' War into a political conflict? Was it Paul III, A, Paul III, B, Cardinal Richelieu, C, Henry VIII, or D, Charles IV? Alright, hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you all on Monday, and we will review for this test. Bye-bye.